She laughed. Not a quiet laugh. A loud, cutting laugh, the kind designed to humiliate, to remind every person in that room exactly where they stood in the hierarchy. Dr. Margaret Holloway, CEO of Blackstone University's academic board, looked at the man in the gray janitor uniform and laughed like he'd just told the funniest joke of her career. Logan Pierce didn't flinch. He just kept writing on that whiteboard, calm, steady, deliberate, while 300 of the world's smartest people sat in silence, slowly realizing they had been wrong for 40 years. And he was the janitor who proved it. Drop a comment with your city right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button. You will not want to miss what happens next. The mop hit the floor at 11:47 p.m. Logan Pierce dragged it across the marble hallway of Blackstone University's Hargrove Mathematics building with the kind of mechanical precision that comes not from caring, but from doing something so many thousands of times that your body just does it. Muscle memory. The same way a soldier loads a rifle. The same way a grieving man gets out of bed. His boots were steel-toed, scuffed at the left heel where he'd caught a corner of the machine press at the shop earlier that afternoon. His hands, the ones pushing the mop handle, were rough, thick at the knuckles, the kind of hands that told a story about a man without him ever opening his mouth. Nobody looked at his hands. Nobody looked at him at all. That was fine with Logan. He moved the mop in long, even strokes and let the sound of the building fill the quiet around him, the distant hum of the HVAC system, the occasional creak of the old structure settling the muffled voices from Conference Room B at the end of the hall. They were still at it. The math people. And he'd noticed them 2 weeks ago. The professors, the visiting academics, the graduate students who carried themselves like they were already famous. They'd taken over 3 rooms on the east wing, whiteboards covered floor-to-ceiling papers stacked on every flat surface, takeout containers piling up in the trash cans Logan emptied every night. He'd read the banner taped crookedly above the conference room door on his first night working that wing, Blackstone Symposium on the Carver-Holland Conjecture. Toward a final resolution, 40 years in the making. Logan had stopped in front of that banner for exactly 4 seconds. Then he'd kept walking because the trash wasn't going to empty itself. That night, like every night, he worked the East Wing last. Partly because of the professors, they stayed late, and he'd learned early in this job that academics didn't like being interrupted. They'd look at him the way people look at a stray dog that wandered into a restaurant. Not mean exactly, just confused. Like his presence required an explanation that the universe had failed to provide. So he waited. Janitor. He sat in the service corridor behind the maintenance closet, back against the cold cinder block wall, and he pulled out the notebook. It wasn't much to look at. A college-ruled composition book, the kind you could buy for 99 cents. The cover was warped from where a coffee cup had sat on it, and about 30 pages were already filled front and back with handwriting so small and dense it looked like a code. Logan uncapped the pen with his teeth, the way he always did, and stared at the page. He'd been working on a problem. Not the Carver-Holland conjecture, not exactly. It was adjacent to it. A question that had nagged at him for about 6 months, one he'd stumbled onto while reading a discarded academic journal he'd found in the trash on the 3rd floor. Someone had thrown it away. Imagine that. He'd rescued it, read it twice on his break, and gone home that night unable to sleep because something in it was wrong. Not obviously wrong, not sloppily wrong. Wrong in the way that only becomes visible when you look at the foundational assumption underneath everything else. The load-bearing wall that no one thinks to check, because the house has been standing for so long. Logan drew a small diagram. 3 nodes, 2 constraints. He labeled them in his shorthand, a private notation system he'd developed over years because he never had anyone to write to, no academic community to communicate, with no conventions to conform to. He just needed to think clearly, and this was how he thought. He stared at what he'd drawn. Then he crossed it out. Started again. From inside conference room B, a voice rose above the others. Authoritative, polished. The voice of a man who expected silence when he spoke, and usually got it. The epsilon-bound assumption is the anchor of the entire proof. Everything above it depends on that constraint holding. Gentlemen and ladies, I have spent 11 years verifying this foundation. It holds. Logan's pen stopped moving. He sat very still. Epsilon-bound assumption. He set the notebook on his knee and let the words settle in his mind, the way water settles in a bowl. Quiet, level, clarifying. He'd seen that assumption. He'd read it not in a textbook, but in a fragment of a 1983 paper he'd found photocopied and paperclipped into the back of the journal from the trash. The original Carver-Holland framework. The one that had launched 40 years of subsequent work. He'd read it and thought that only holds if the boundary condition doesn't degrade under higher-order iteration. Does it? Had anyone checked? His pen moved again, slowly at first, then faster. He didn't leave until 1:15 a.m. The building was silent by then. Real silence, the kind that has weight. Logan loaded his cart, clocked out at the maintenance office, and walked across the parking lot to his 2009 Chevy Silverado with the cracked passenger side mirror and the car seat in the back that was technically too small for Emma now. But she still asked to sit in sometimes when she was tired. He sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Opened the notebook again. The parking lot light above him flickered twice held. He looked at the diagram. Looked at the assumption he'd written out in full, using the precise notation from the original paper. Looked at the higher order constraint he'd placed alongside it. Then he worked through it, step by step. The way he'd always done math, not performing it, not displaying it, just following it the way you follow a river to see where it goes. By the time he was done, his handwriting had filled 4 pages. The assumption didn't hold. Not under those conditions. Not when you extended it the way Rennick, that was the voice from conference room B. He'd seen the name on the symposium program posted outside the door, not when you extended it the way Rennick's framework required. It collapsed. Quietly, invisibly, at a depth that 40 years of brilliant people had simply never looked. Logan closed the notebook. He sat there for a moment in the flickering parking lot light, a 38-year-old machine shop technician and university janitor who had never finished his mathematics degree, and he felt something move through him that he didn't have a clean word for. Not pride, not vindication, more like recognition. The feeling you get when you've been staring at a word for so long it stops looking like a word, and then suddenly it snaps back into focus and you can read it again. He drove home. Emma was asleep on the couch, still in her school clothes, a half-eaten bowl of cereal on the coffee table beside her. The babysitter, Mrs. Kowalski from 4C, who watched Emma on Logan's night shifts and refused to charge him more than $10, because she said it was practically criminal what life had handed him, had left a note on the kitchen counter. She asked me to wake her up when you got home. I didn't. She needs sleep more than she needs to see you at 1 a.m. Don't argue with me, Logan. He didn't argue. He stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at his daughter, the dark circles under her eyes that came from being 7 and going to school tired, because her dad worked nights, the crayon drawing half hanging off the coffee table that said Dad in big uneven letters, surrounded by something that was either a sun or a pinwheel. And he picked her up carefully, carried her to her room, tucked her in. She stirred. Her eyes opened just barely. Dad. Yeah, Bug. Did you solve it? He paused in the doorway. Getting there, he said. She was asleep before the words landed. Logan Pierce had not always been a janitor. He'd been a student once. University of Michigan Mathematics Program full scholarship. He'd been the kind of student that professors sometimes get once in a decade, maybe the kind where you stop mid-sentence during a lecture, because the student in the 3rd row has asked a question that's better than the one you were about to ask yourself. That student had been Logan. He lasted 2.5 years. Then his mother got sick first. Then his father's trucking business went under. Then he withdrew from school to work and send money home because that's what you did when you were Logan Pierce, because what other option was there? He always told himself he'd go back. He had the credits. He had more than the credits. He had the mind, which doesn't require credits, doesn't require enrollment, doesn't require permission from anyone. He kept reading, kept notebooks, kept working. Then he met Sarah, and for 3 years, the notebooks took a back seat to building something together. Then Emma was born, and the notebooks took a deeper back seat, but they didn't disappear because Logan wasn't capable of not thinking mathematically any more than he was capable of not breathing. Then Sarah left. Not dramatically, not with screaming or lawyers, at least not at first. She just couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't do the 2 jobs and the small apartment, and the man who came home exhausted and ate dinner standing over the sink, and fell asleep on the couch with a math notebook on his chest. "I feel like I'm competing with something I can't even see," she told him once. She wasn't wrong. She took a new job in Portland. She called Emma on Sundays. Logan didn't hate her for it. Hating her would have required energy he didn't have, and anyway, Emma needed him to carry the household without bitterness, and so he did. You do what you have to do. That was the Logan Pierce philosophy distilled. The symposium was 3 days away when Logan heard the conversation that changed everything. He was cleaning the men's bathroom adjacent to the main conference room. Not glamorous, but that's the job. When the door opened and 2 voices entered mid-argument. "Rennick won't hear it, Marcus. He never does." I'm not saying the framework is wrong. I'm saying there's a gap in the epsilon derivation a gap that he's been told about before. He dismissed it. You want to stand up in front of 300 colleagues and call Arthur Rennick's proof incomplete. Someone has to. A pause. The sound of water running. Not you. You're not tenured yet. You want to end your career before it starts. Silence. Just let it go. Maybe it holds. Maybe we're wrong. We're not wrong. The door opened, closed. Gone. Logan stood with the cleaning cloth in his hand and looked at the wall. We're not wrong. No, Logan thought. You're not. He knew that voice. He'd seen the 2 of them in the hall that week. The younger one, thin kid with wire-rimmed glasses, probably a postdoc. He had the look of a man who knows something important and has no one safe to say it to. Logan understood that look from the inside. That night in the service corridor, he didn't work on his own problem. He worked on Rennick's. He pulled apart every element of the epsilon-bound assumption he'd been able to reconstruct from memory, and from the fragments he'd read, laid it out in his private notation, and tested it. Then he tested it again. Then he sat with the result for a long time. The assumption collapsed under exactly the conditions Rennick's framework required it to hold. As it wasn't a gap, it wasn't a nuance, it was structural. The kind of error that doesn't just weaken a proof, it unravels the entire architecture. 40 years, 12 derivative theorems, hundreds of papers, dozens of academic careers built on this foundation. And the foundation had a crack in it that had never been properly examined. Logan pressed his palms flat against the notebook page, the way he used to do at the university library, when he found something important and needed to feel the physical reality of it before his mind could accept what it was showing him. He thought about the postdoc in the bathroom. You're not tenured yet. You want to end your career before it starts. Logan almost laughed. He didn't have a career. He had a mop and a machine press and a 2009 Silverado and a 7-year-old who asked him if he'd solved it. He had nothing to lose. He almost didn't go. Let's be honest about that. He stood in his apartment the morning of the symposium, in his cleanest jeans and a button-down he'd ironed twice because the iron was old and the creases kept coming out crooked, and he thought, "What are you doing?"
Heartfelt.
Who was he? He didn't have a degree. He didn't have credentials. He didn't have an institution or a title or a published paper to his name. He had notebooks. He had a mind that never stopped running. He had a proof that he was as certain of as he had ever been certain of anything in his life. And he had Emma, who was watching him iron his shirt with the solemn attention of a child who senses a big moment without being able to name it. "Where are you going, Dad?" "To a thing at the university." "For your janitor job?" "No." He looked at her. "For something else." She considered this. "Are you nervous?" "Yeah," he said. "A little." She nodded gravely the way 7-year-olds do when they're trying very hard to be helpful. "You always say the answer is either right or it isn't. So if you're right, you're right, right." He stared at her. She looked back at him with Sarah's eyes and his stubbornness and something that was entirely her own. "Right," he said. He finished ironing the shirt. He sat in the back row, 300 people. The room smelled like coffee and ambition, and the particular strain of anxiety that comes from a gathering of people who all need to impress each other. Logan knew no one. No one knew him. A few people glanced at him when he sat down, not with recognition, just with that brief animal awareness of a body moving into their peripheral vision. Then they looked away. Dr. Arthur Rennick stood at the front of the room. He was taller than Logan had imagined from the voice through the bathroom wall, 60-something with silver hair that had been arranged to look effortless and hadn't quite gotten there. He wore a jacket that cost more than Logan made in a week. He had the ease of a man who has stood at the front of rooms for 30 years and stopped noticing that he was doing it. He smiled at the audience the way you smile at something you already own. 40 years ago. Rennick began. Harold Carver and Diana Holland posed a problem they believed would take a decade to resolve. Light chuckles through the room. It has taken somewhat longer. Another smile. But today, I am pleased to present a framework for final resolution that has been 11 years in development and has been reviewed by the finest mathematical minds in this institution. Applause. Genuine warm. The room loved him. Logan opened his notebook to a clean page and wrote in small, careful letters, at the top, epsilon-bound degradation, under higher order iteration. Then, he waited. Rennick spoke for 40 minutes. Logan listened to every word. He followed the argument like a man reading a map carefully, systematically, always watching for the moment when the road they were on curved away from where it was supposed to go. It came at the 32nd minute. Rennick presented the epsilon-bound assumption with the confidence of a man laying down a trump card. "This constraint," he said, tapping the whiteboard, "has been the load-bearing element of the framework. It has been tested. It holds." Logan wrote, "Does it hold under the constraints imposed by Lemma 7? Check the iteration depth." He checked. His hand stopped. It didn't hold. Not here. Not the way Rennick was using it. The framework required the assumption to be stable at a depth that if you worked through the higher-order implications of Lemma 7, which apparently no one had done, or if they had, they'd accepted Rennick's prior assurances without running the full test, it simply wasn't stable at. The whole thing was going to collapse. The whole thing was Bandi. The entire elegant, celebrated 11 years in development framework was going to fall apart right at its foundation, and the man at the front of the room was smiling and accepting applause, and had no idea. Logan sat with his hand raised for 45 seconds before anyone noticed. A graduate student near the front saw him first, leaned over and said something to the colleague beside her. That colleague glanced back, looked forward, glanced back again. Rennick wrapped up. Questions, comments. I welcome both. Logan's hand was still in the air. Rennick scanned the room. For a moment, just a moment, he seemed to skip over the back row entirely. Then someone near the aisle gestured subtly, and Rennick's gaze landed on Logan. A pause, almost imperceptible. Yes, in the back. Logan stood. He was aware in the sharp physical way you're aware of things when adrenaline clarifies the world of how he looked. The jeans, the ironed shirt, the hands. He didn't have a lanyard or a badge. He wasn't sitting with a department. He was just a man who had come in off the street and raised his hand. He said, "The epsilon-bound assumption doesn't hold under the constraints your own lemma 7 imposes." Complete silence. Then Rennick's face did something that was almost a smile. Almost indulgent. "I'm sorry, and you are." "Logan Pierce." "And your institution, Mr. Pierce." "I don't have one." A ripple through the room, a few half-laughs, confused and polite. Rennick tilted his head as though deciding how much patience to demonstrate. "I see. And what is your background in mathematics?" Logan held his gaze. "I clean this building at night, but I've been working through your framework for the last 2 weeks, and the epsilon-bound degrades under higher-order iteration at exactly the depth your lemma 7 requires it to be stable. The assumption collapses." The half-laughs became real ones. From across the room, from the second row where the board members sat, came a sound that cut through everything else. Clear, deliberate carrying. Dr. Margaret Holloway, CEO of the Academic Board, head of the Blackstone Foundation. The woman who signed every check that funded every project in this building threw her head back and laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a surprised laugh. A real one. Long and loud and dismissive, the kind that tells a room exactly what it's allowed to think. "The janitor," she said to no one in particular, to everyone, "has found a flaw in Rennick's proof." More laughter. Loud now, rolling through the room. Logan Pierce stood in the back row and let it wash over him. He thought about Emma's eyes. He thought about the notebook with 4 pages of work that said what it said regardless of who was laughing. He thought about the postdoc in the bathroom who had seen the problem too and had been told to let it go. He didn't sit down. Rennick raised a hand for quiet, and the room complied. He looked at Logan with an expression that had moved past amusement into something closer to contempt, dressed up as patience. "Mr. Pierce, if you believe you've identified a flaw in a proof that has been reviewed by 100 of the world's foremost mathematicians—" "I don't believe it," Logan said. His voice was quiet level. It carried anyway. "I've proven it. If you give me the whiteboard, I'll show you." The room went very still. Rennick stared at him. And then, because the one thing Arthur Rennick could not afford was to appear afraid of a janitor with a notebook, he swept his hand toward the whiteboard with the theatrical grace of a man who has already decided the next 30 seconds will be the funniest thing that's happened all year. "By all means," Rennick said. "Show us." Logan picked up his notebook and walked to the front of the room. 300 people watched him move. He reached the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and he began. He didn't start with formulas. That surprised them. You could feel it, the shift in the room, as people leaned forward slightly, recalibrating, because what Logan wrote first wasn't a proof. It was a question. 3 words in large, clear letters at the top of the board. "What do we assume?" Then he drew a box. Clean lines. A simple structural diagram, the kind you'd use to explain load-bearing architecture to someone who'd never studied engineering. Inside the box, the epsilon-bound assumption labeled precisely in the exact notation from Rennick's own framework. Then he drew what happens when you apply lemma 7. The room began to change. He could feel it happening, that subtle atmospheric shift, like the pressure change before a storm. The laughter was gone. The whispers were dying. People were looking at the board not with amusement anymore, but with something more dangerous. Recognition. The room had not been this quiet in 40 years of mathematics conferences. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting. Not the respectful quiet of people listening to someone they already believe. This was the other kind, the held-breath quiet of 300 brilliant people watching something happen that they could not yet name, could not yet categorize, and were not yet sure they were allowed to feel. Logan Pierce stood at the whiteboard with a black marker in his hand, and he did not look at the audience. He looked at the board. That was the first thing people would remember later. Not what he wrote, not even what he said, but the fact that he didn't perform for them. He just worked. Like he was back in the service corridor behind the maintenance closet, back against the cinder block wall, notebook on his knee, following the math wherever it went, because that's what you did with math when you actually respected it. He had written 3 words at the top of the board, "What do we assume?" And then he had drawn the structural diagram, simple and clear, and inside it, the epsilon-bound assumption labeled precisely in Rennick's own notation. Now he moved to the right side of the board and wrote a single lemma. Lemma 7, Rennick's own lemma. He wrote it out completely, every term, every condition, the way you'd write out a legal contract clause, before explaining why it contradicted another clause on page 40. Then he drew a line connecting the 2 boxes. Then he wrote 1 question mark at the point of connection. Dr. Marcus Webb, seated in the 5th row, leaned forward and gripped the armrest of his chair. He was the postdoc from the bathroom, the one who'd been told to let it go. His face had gone the particular color of a man who has been sitting on something explosive for 6 months and is now watching a stranger light the fuse. "What is he doing?" whispered the woman beside Marcus. Dr. Una Park, visiting from Seoul National, her pen suspended above her notepad. "He's checking the iteration depth," Marcus said so quietly, it barely qualified as sound. "He's actually checking the iteration depth." "Has anyone done that?" Marcus said nothing. Logan spoke for the first time since he'd picked up the marker. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When Rennick's framework applies the epsilon bound here, he tapped the first box. It requires stability at depth 4 of the higher order iteration. Lemma 7 establishes the iteration parameters. He tapped the second box. These 2 things need to be compatible. They need to hold together under the same conditions. He paused. Just 1 beat. They don't. From the front row, Dr. Arthur Rennick said in a tone that was still managing to hold on to its condescension by its fingernails. "Mr. Pierce, the epsilon bound has been verified." "Verified at depth 2, Logan said, not cutting him off, completing the sentence more accurately than Rennick had. "The original Carver-Holland verification, 1983, tested stability at depth 2. Your framework." He tapped the board again. "Requires it at depth 4. Nobody ran the test at depth 4. He looked at the board, not at Rennick. "I did." The silence changed texture, became denser. Beep. Margaret Holloway, from her seat in the 2nd row, had stopped smiling. She was watching Logan with the focused attention of a woman who had run organizations for 25 years and had developed a very accurate internal sensor for the moment when something she had dismissed was turning out to be real. She didn't look alarmed yet, but she was watching. Rennick stood. Physically stood from his chair in the front row the way a man stands when he needs the authority of his full height. He was 6'2". Logan was 5'11". The height difference was noticeable. Rennick walked toward the board slowly, hands clasped behind his back. Professor's posture. Absolute calm. "Show me the degradation," Rennick said quietly. Just to Logan, not to the room. Logan looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then he turned to the board and began to write. He wrote fast, not frantically with the speed of a man transcribing something he's already thought through completely, every step already mapped, just needing to move it from inside his head onto the surface in front of him. 4 lines. 7 lines. He used his own notation for 2 steps, then caught himself and translated into standard academic form, because this wasn't about his private system. This was about showing the work in a language the room could follow. Rennick stood beside him, arms still clasped, reading as Logan wrote. The room watched Rennick's face. This was in the end what everyone would talk about afterward. Not the mathematics, the face. The way Rennick's expression moved through its stages, like a man descending stairs in the dark, 1 careful foot at a time, not yet knowing that a step was missing. First studied patience. The performance of a man tolerating a minor irritation. Then engagement. Involuntary, the kind the brain produces before the ego can stop it. His eyes moved faster. His chin dipped slightly. Then something else. Something that had no clean name. the way a face looks in the instant it encounters something it was not prepared for. Logan wrote the final line and stepped back. The room did not breathe. Rennick stared at the board. Marcus Webb was on his feet without knowing he'd stood up. He wasn't alone. 3 other mathematicians in the 4th and 5th rows had leaned forward until they were almost out of their seats, hands braced on the chairs in front of them. Dr. Elaine Chen, senior fellow from Caltech. One of the 3 people in the room. Rennick, considered his intellectual equal, stood up from the side section where the visiting faculty were seated and walked toward the board. Unhurried. Precise. She pulled her reading glasses from her jacket pocket, put them on, and stood 2 feet from the whiteboard reading. Nobody tried to stop her. Nobody said a word. She read for 2 minutes. Real minutes measured time, the kind that accumulates weight as it passes. The room felt every second. Then Elaine Chen took off her glasses, held them in both hands, and turned to look at Arthur Rennick. She said very quietly, "He's right." The room erupted. Not in applause. In noise, the particular explosive sound of 300 people all trying to process the same piece of information simultaneously. Chairs scraping, multiple conversations detonating at once. Someone near the back said, "That's not possible," loud enough to be heard over everything else, and someone else immediately said, "Look at the board, look at line 6. Rennick had not moved. He was still standing beside Logan, still looking at the board, and his face had finally arrived at the expression it had been moving toward this whole time. Not anger, not humiliation, though those were coming. Something more fundamental. The look of a man who has built a house on a particular piece of ground and has just been shown that the ground was never stable. Logan capped his marker and set it on the tray. He did not look triumphant. He did not look relieved. He looked like a man who has just completed a piece of work and is already thinking about the next problem. Margaret Holloway stood up. The room didn't quiet immediately. She had to let her presence do the work, and it did, because 25 years of institutional authority has a sound that rooms respond to without knowing why. One by one, the separate conversations died down. She looked at Logan. He looked back at her. She had laughed at him 20 minutes ago. They both knew it. The room knew it. She did not apologize. That was not Margaret Holloway's way. Instead, she said in a voice that was perfectly controlled and gave nothing away, "Walk us through it, from the beginning, every step." It was not a request. Logan looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the board, picked up the marker, and said, "Okay." He started from 0. Not from where he'd left off. From the actual beginning. The original 1983 assumption, its structure, its stated conditions, what it claimed to establish. He built the argument the way a contractor walks a client through a building inspection. This is the foundation. This is what the foundation claims to support. This is the load it's actually being asked to carry. And here, right here, is where the load exceeds the capacity. He spoke for 20 minutes. Nobody laughed. Professors who had published papers building on Rennick's framework were sitting with their phones out, pulling up their own work cross-referencing in real time. Marcus Webb had produced a legal pad from somewhere and was writing at full speed. Una Park had her laptop open and was running calculations. 3 graduate students had quietly moved from their seats to a position where they could see the board more clearly. Rennick sat down at the 40-minute mark. He sat down heavily in the way that a man sits when his legs have decided something before his mind catches up. He pulled out his own notebook, a proper leather-bound academic notebook fat, with decades of work, and opened it. Started writing. His expression had closed off completely, gone interior, the way a person's face goes when they stop performing for the room and start actually thinking. Logan noticed. He did not acknowledge it. He kept going. At the 50-minute mark, Dr. Elaine Chen spoke from her position beside the board. She had not sat back down. She had stayed standing right there, reading and rereading as Logan built the argument in real time. She said, "The implication for Darby's 2001 extension, Membetum Dan." "It falls too," Logan said without breaking pace. "The extension inherits the assumption. Same depth problem worse, because Darby added another layer of iteration on top. 3 of the 4 theorems in that paper are affected." Chen made a sound. Not quite a word. The involuntary sound of a mathematician encountering a truth that rearranges furniture. 12 years of... "I know," Logan said. She looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time, not at the board, but at the man. "How long have you been working on this?" "About 2 weeks. On Rennick's proof specifically." He paused. "The underlying question may be 6 months." 6 months, she repeated. "I found a journal in the trash," Logan said. "3rd floor. Someone threw it out." The room was so quiet that 3 people in different parts of it heard those words clearly and would repeat them later in hallways and offices and phone calls. The story getting passed along with the particular electric energy of a story that sounds too specific to be fictional. Someone found a journal in the trash. Margaret Holloway was watching Logan with an expression that had moved through several phases in the last hour and had now arrived somewhere that wasn't quite readable. She was a woman who had built her career on the ability to assess people quickly and accurately. She ran 3 research divisions, managed a $400 million endowment, and had over 25 years. Learned to identify the difference between a person who was genuinely exceptional and a person who merely seemed exceptional under the right lighting. She was having trouble categorizing Logan Pierce, and the difficulty itself was information. She said, "Mr. Pierce, do you have any formal academic background in mathematics?" 2.5 years at Michigan, Logan said. "I left. My mother got sick." Brief silence. "That's all?" "That's all." She held his gaze. He held hers back, not aggressively, not nervously. The way a man looks at another person when he has nothing to hide and nothing to prove and is simply present in the room. She said, "Where's your proof, the full reconstruction?" Logan reached into the inside pocket of his ironed button-down, the pocket he'd almost not put anything in this morning, standing in his apartment wondering why he was doing this, and pulled out the composition notebook. Warped cover. Dense handwriting. The 99-cent notebook from a drugstore in his neighborhood. He set it on the table in front of Margaret Holloway. She looked at it. She did not touch it for a moment. Then she opened it. She turned pages, slowly reading. Around her 2 other board members leaned in. Elaine Chen moved from the whiteboard to the table, looking over Holloway's shoulder, and then stopped pretending to look over her shoulder, and simply pulled a chair around and sat beside her to read properly. The room watched this happen. Rennick was still writing in his leather notebook. He had not spoken in 30 minutes. He was working, actually working, running through the implications the way Logan had run through them in the parking lot at 1 a.m. following the river to see where it went. His graduate student, a young woman named Priya, who had been with his lab for 3 years, leaned over and said quietly, "Professor, if the assumption doesn't hold at depth 4, then the entire 3rd chapter..." "I know," Rennick said. "The conference proceedings. We already submitted the..." "I know, Priya." She sat back. She looked at Logan, who was standing quietly near the whiteboard, not performing, not demanding attention, just waiting, the marker still in his hand. She thought about the fact that she'd glanced at this man last week when he was mopping the hallway outside the conference room. She had not registered him as a person. She had registered him as part of the building. She felt something she was not used to feeling, and would spend a long time afterward trying to name correctly. It wasn't quite guilt. It was something more uncomfortable than guilt. The recognition that your categories had failed you, that you had organized the world in a way that was efficient and also deeply structurally wrong. Marcus Webb, who had been writing at full speed on his legal pad, stood up from his chair and said louder than he intended, "The Prentice-Okafor theorem. If this holds, if the epsilon bound really degrades at depth 4, the Prentice-Okafor theorem is the next thing that comes apart." The room reacted again. Another wave. Because Prentice Okafor was not a minor paper. It was foundational to 3 active research programs, 2 of which had people in this room right now. Someone needs to run the full computation, Chen said from her position beside Holloway at the table. She was still reading Logan's notebook, turning pages with careful hands. Before we make any more claims about downstream effects, we need the full computation. I can set that up within the hour, Marcus said. He was already reaching for his phone. Use my lab system, Chen said. It's faster. Done. Logan watched this happen. Watched the room reorganize itself around the problem. People pulling out devices, moving to cluster with colleagues, the particular organized chaos of a group of specialists, shifting from passive audience to active investigators. The symposium had not been canceled. It had transformed into something else entirely. A different kind of event, less polished, more real. Rennick stood up. He stood up slowly with the careful deliberateness of a very tall man who has been sitting in a small chair for a long time and has also just had the worst hour of his professional life. He straightened his jacket. He walked toward the whiteboard. He stopped beside Logan. For a moment, he just looked at the board. At Logan's work, his clear and systematic dismantling of 11 years of Rennick's most significant project, written in plain marker on the whiteboard of the room Rennick had reserved for his moment of triumph. Then Arthur Rennick looked at Logan Pierce, janitor, machine shop technician, single father, 2.5-year dropout from Michigan, a man whose hands were rough at the knuckles and whose shirt had slightly crooked ironing lines, and he said in a voice that only Logan could hear, "How did no one catch this?" It was not a question. It was the sound a man makes when he realizes that the answer is more complicated than the math and more painful. Logan said, everyone assumed it had been checked. By who? By whoever checked it before them. Rennick absorbed this. And no one was first. No one admitted to being first, Logan said. Rennick looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up a red marker from the tray at the bottom of the whiteboard, uncapped it, and drew a clean red circle around the moment of degradation on the board. The exact point Logan had identified. He stood there looking at it. "You're foolproof," he said finally. "The one in the notebook. Have you written a formal version? No. You need to." Rennick's voice was flat, professional. He had moved through whatever he needed to move through privately and had arrived at a place that was purely functional. This needs to go through peer review. If it holds under formal scrutiny, and I think it will, this needs to be published. "I'm a janitor," Logan said. "I'm aware of what you do at night," Rennick said, and there was something in his voice that was complicated and real, and not quite what Logan had expected. "I'm telling you what you are during every other hour." Logan looked at the man. Rennick looked back. Across the room, Margaret Holloway closed the composition notebook and set it carefully on the table in front of her, the way you set down something you don't want damaged. She folded her hands on top of it. She looked at Logan Pierce, janitor, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I want to talk to you, after this, not in this room." Logan nodded. The afternoon continued. Marcus Webb's computation came back 47 minutes later, delivered via text to Chen, who read it, looked up, and said to the room in a voice that was entirely steady and entirely devastating, "It confirms. The degradation is real. Depth 4, exactly where Pierce identified it. The bound collapses. No eruption this time. The room had already spent its eruption. What happened now was quieter, and in some ways more powerful. The sound of 300 people updating their understanding of something they thought was settled. The particular silence of minds doing the slow, serious work of accepting a truth that was expensive and necessary. Logan stood near the back of the room again. He'd moved back there sometime after the computation results came in, not out of deference, but out of habit. The back was where he belonged, where he always sat, where a man sits when he's been invisible long enough that it becomes comfortable. Marcus Webb found him there. "For what it's worth," Marcus said. "I knew there was something wrong. I've been saying it for months. Nobody would listen." "I know," Logan said. "I heard you." Marcus looked at him. "In the bathroom." "Yeah." A pause. "You work nights here." "I do." Marcus processed this. Then, with the honesty of a man who had been humbled by the afternoon and was still in the process of integrating it, he said, "I'm sorry I didn't—" He stopped. "I didn't see you." "Nobody does," Logan said. "That's fine." "It's not actually." Logan looked at him. The young postdoc with the wire-rimmed glasses, who had known the truth and had been told his career couldn't survive saying it, who had let it go. "You knew," Logan said. "You didn't have anything to gain and everything to lose. I had nothing to lose." He paused. "That's not a character difference. That's just math." Marcus laughed, a short, surprised sound, the kind that comes out when something lands harder than expected. Then he stuck out his hand. "Marcus Webb." Logan Pierce. They shook hands. At the front of the room, Margaret Holloway was on her phone speaking quietly, and whatever she was saying, the person on the other end was listening. Margaret Holloway did not do small talk. Logan figured that out in the first 30 seconds of being in the same room with her alone. She had commandeered one of the smaller faculty offices off the main hallway, the kind of room that belonged to someone who wasn't there that day, furnished with the impersonal tidiness of a space that gets used but never inhabited. She sat on one side of the desk. She gestured for Logan to sit on the other. Then she looked at him the way she probably looked at balance sheets and acquisition proposals, completely without sentiment, searching for the number that told the real story. "How old are you?" she asked. 38. "Michigan. 2.5 years. What was your focus?" "Pure mathematics. Some computational theory." "GPA. 398 when I left." She absorbed this without expression. "And after Michigan, self-taught." "I kept reading. I kept working." "Where?" "Wherever I could." He paused. "Parking lots mostly. Break rooms. My daughter goes to sleep at 9:30. I work until 1:30. Holloway was quiet for a moment. Her hands were flat on the desk, perfectly still, the way hands are when someone is thinking hard and has trained themselves not to show it physically. "Tonight," she said, "you were scheduled to clean this building. I took a personal day. To come to an academic symposium you weren't invited to." "Yes." "And walk to the front of the room." "Yes." She looked at him. "What made you certain enough to do that?" Logan thought about Emma. About the parking lot at 1 a.m. with the flickering light. About 4 pages of handwriting that said what they said regardless of who was in the room. "The math was right," he said. "That's all. Either it's right or it isn't." Something moved in Holloway's face. Not softness, she wasn't a soft person, he'd already understood that. Something more like recognition, the kind that comes when a person hears a version of something they believe themselves. She picked up the composition notebook from the desk where she'd set it when she came in. She held it in both hands, looking at the cover, the warped corner where the coffee cup had sat. "This," she said, "this is the full proof. Draft version. I'd need to formalize the notation, write the context properly. Maybe 2 weeks of work." "2 weeks? Maybe 3. I'm working 2 jobs." She set the notebook down. "Not for much longer." Logan looked at her. "Ms. Holloway." "Dr. Holloway. Dr. Holloway. Whatever you're thinking about doing, I need you to understand something. I'm not looking for a position. I'm not looking for an office or a title. I have a daughter in 2nd grade and I need to pay rent in 14 days, and I have a shift at the machine shop tomorrow at 6 a.m. "I understand all of that," Holloway said. "I'm not offering you charity." She paused, and when she continued, her voice had shifted to something harder and more precise, the register of a person stating terms. "I'm telling you that what you did this afternoon has consequences that go beyond this building." You have identified a structural flaw in 40 years of accepted mathematics. That has implications for a minimum of 24 published theorems, 3 active research programs, and 11 papers currently under peer review. That is not a small afternoon. That is a significant event. She looked at him steadily. And significant events require management. Do you understand me? Logan said, I think so. The academic world is going to respond to this in 2 ways. Some people will recognize it immediately for what it is and move to engage with it honestly. Others. She paused, and her expression told him that she knew exactly who those others were and had spent decades dealing with them, will look for a way to contain it, to minimize it, to find a reason why the conclusion is wrong or the source is unreliable. She let that land. You are not credentialed. You have no institutional affiliation. You are a janitor who walked into a symposium and challenged a tenured professor in front of 300 people. There are individuals in that room right now who are going to spend the next 72 hours looking for a way to make this about your background instead of about the mathematics. Logan was quiet. I've seen it done to people who had every credential, she said. With you, it will be easier for them, unless someone makes it harder. And you want to do that? I want to fund it, she said. Independent Research Fellowship. 6 months renewable, enough to cover your bills and your daughter and your time so you can write the formal proof without working a night shift. She opened her hands, a gesture that was almost impatient, as if the math of it were obvious, and she was waiting for him to catch up. You write the proof. We submit it to a journal. It goes through peer review on its own merits, which I believe it will survive. And when it comes out the other side, your name is on it. Not the university's name, yours. Logan sat with this for a moment. Why? He said. She didn't pretend not to understand the question. Because I was in that room. I was one of the people who laughed. She said it without apology and without self-flagellation, as a simple statement of fact, the way a person of a certain type acknowledges an error cleanly and then moves to the correction. And because I have spent 25 years identifying people who think differently than institutions train people to think. They're rare. Rarer than any institution wants to admit, because institutions tend to reproduce themselves. She looked at him with something that was almost not quite but almost respect. You don't think like someone who was trained. You think like someone who was never told what the boundaries were. Because no one told me. Exactly, she said. And that is at this moment the most valuable thing about you. Logan looked at the notebook on the desk between them. The 99-cent composition book with the warped cover and the dense handwriting and 4 pages that had just dismantled 40 years of academic structure in a room full of the smartest people in the field. He said, I need to call my daughter. Holloway blinked. It was the first time in the conversation that he'd said something she hadn't been fully prepared for. Excuse me. She's with a neighbor. I told her I'd call when I was done. He stood. I'll be back in 10 minutes. He walked out into the hallway and pulled out his phone, the cracked screen Android he'd been meaning to replace for 8 months, and called Emma. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been holding the phone. Dad, how did it go? Good, he said. Did you solve it? He leaned against the hallway wall, closed his eyes briefly. Yeah, Bug, I solved it. Did the smart people listen? Eventually. Good. A pause. Mrs. Kowalski made pierogies. She said to tell you there are some in the fridge. Tell her thank you. Are you coming home? Soon. I have one more conversation. Okay. And then, with the terrible accuracy of a 7-year-old, is it a good conversation or a scary one? Logan thought about Margaret Holloway on the other side of the office door. About 6 months and enough money to pay rent and a formal proof with his name on it. About the postdoc with wire-rimmed glasses who'd known the truth and been told to let it go. About 40 years of a wrong assumption quietly holding up the wrong weight and a 99-cent notebook that had noticed. I think it might be both, he said. That's usually the important ones. Emma said very seriously. Watole. He almost laughed. Yeah, that's what I figured. He went back inside. He sat down across from Holloway, looked at her directly, and said, Okay. Tell me what the fellowship looks like, the actual numbers, and I want it in writing before I leave this building. Holloway almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. I had my assistant start drafting the agreement 20 minutes ago, she said, while we were talking. Logan looked at her. I was fairly confident you'd say yes, she said. You were confident I'd say yes after you laughed at me in front of 300 people. She met his eyes without flinching. I was wrong this afternoon. I was right just now. Both things can be true. She picked up her phone and typed a short message. The draft will be ready in 15 minutes. Do you want coffee while we wait? He said yes. The coffee was better than anything he'd had in months. Nida. The draft arrived in 12 minutes. Logan read every word slowly, carefully, with the attention of a man who had learned not to assume that the floor was where it appeared to be. He asked 3 questions. Holloway answered 2 of them immediately and made one modification to the language in the 3rd clause. Then Logan signed it, and Holloway signed it, and a document that had not existed 6 hours ago was now real and binding, and would change the next year of his life in ways he could not fully map from where he was standing. He walked out of this building at 6:17 p.m. The parking lot was getting dark. His Silverado was one of the few cars left sitting under the same flickering light as always, the cracked passenger mirror catching the last of the afternoon. He stood beside it for a moment before getting in. The symposium had ended, or rather transformed, sometime around 3 in the afternoon. People had drifted out gradually in the way people leave a room when the event that was supposed to happen has been replaced by a different and more demanding one. Logan had watched them go from his position near the back. Some had left looking stunned. Some had left already on their phones, already in motion, the way academics move when they've identified a problem that intersects with their work and they need to get back to their desks. A few had stopped near him on the way out and said things, brief, careful things, the verbal equivalent of a handshake from someone who is still working out what their relationship to you is going to be. One of them had been Elaine Chen. She'd stopped beside him and said without preamble, "Write it up properly. All the steps, every assumption stated explicitly. Don't abbreviate anything." She'd handed him a business card. "When you have a draft, send it to me, before the journal." She'd paused, then added, "I'll give you my honest assessment. Not the political one, the honest one." He'd put the card in his shirt pocket next to his heart, without really thinking about why he put it there, instead of in his pants pocket like everything else. Now, he got into the Silverado and sat behind the wheel. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He looked at it. "Dr. Marcus Webb, my number. Call me when you're ready to talk about Prentice Okafor. I think there are 2 more downstream collapses we haven't identified yet, and I think you're going to see them before I do." Logan read the text twice. Then he set the phone face down on the passenger seat. He drove home. Emma was still awake. Technically being that she was lying on the couch with her eyes most of the way, closed, her hair loose, and her sock feet tucked under a throw pillow. Mrs. Kowalski's cat, sitting on her legs with the implacable authority of a cat that has decided this is its position, and that's final. Mrs. Kowalski herself was in the kitchen finishing the dishes, and called out without looking up. "Pierogies are in the fridge. Don't heat them in the microwave, use the pan." "Yes, ma'am." Emma opened her eyes all the way. "Dad? Hey, Bug. You look different." He sat on the edge of the couch, which required negotiating with the cat, who moved 1 inch out of principle and no further. Different how? She studied him with the particular seriousness she deployed when she was reading a situation the way he'd taught her to read math, looking at it from the outside, first seeing the shape of it before you tried to name its parts. "Like when you finish a really hard problem," she said finally. "Except more." He put his hand on her foot. The cat looked at his hand and decided not to escalate. "Something changed today," he said. Good changed or bad changed? I don't know yet. Both maybe. He thought about Holloway's voice. Significant events require management. He thought about Rennick drawing a red circle around the error with his own hand. He thought about the sound of 300 people going quiet all at once. Something big happened. It's going to take a while to understand what it means. Emma sat up slightly, dislodging the cat who relocated to the armrest with great dignity. Did people be mean to you? He looked at her. 7 years old, second grade, asking the question that cut through everything else directly to the thing that mattered. Some people laughed at first. Because of your clothes. Because of what I said. But you were right. Yeah. She processed this. And then did they stop laughing? Yes, he said. They stopped. She nodded slowly, satisfied with this outcome, in the way children are satisfied, when the world has behaved according to their sense of what's fair, which happens less often than it should. Good, she said, because laughing at people for being right is really stupid. Just. He almost said something. Instead, he just looked at her. Sarah's eyes, his stubbornness, the thing that was entirely her own, and felt the weight of the day settle into something that wasn't quite lightness, but was adjacent to it. The compound pressure of 2 jobs and 14 days until rent, and 18 years of carrying advanced mathematics in his head with nowhere to put it, and then one afternoon in a room full of the smartest people in the field, where it had finally, gone somewhere. He heated the pierogies in the pan the way he'd been instructed, and ate standing up at the kitchen counter, notebook open beside him, adding 3 new lines of thought that had come to him on the drive home, because the brain doesn't clock out just because the day is over. Mrs. Kowalski left at 8:30. Emma fell asleep for real at 9:15. Logan sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop, the 5-year-old one, with the sticky T key, and began for the first time to write the formal version. Not the notebook shorthand, the real thing, the language of a paper, context notation definitions. Every assumption stated explicitly, the way Chen had told him, every step justified, nothing abbreviated, nothing taken on faith. He worked until 1 a.m. When he stopped, he had 11 pages. Rough, incomplete, the skeleton of a thing that wasn't yet a thing, but the right skeleton, the right structure. He saved it to a flash drive, and to the cloud, and to an email he sent to himself, because he had learned a long time ago not to trust that the things you build will be there when you come back to them, and redundancy is not paranoia, it's just engineering. He went to bed. The next morning, the world had not yet caught up to what had happened in that conference room, but it was starting. At 7:43 a.m., while Logan was dropping Emma at school, and then heading to the machine shop, the email chains had already started. The academics who'd been in the room were writing to each other, forwarding, attaching screenshots of the whiteboard they'd taken on their phones, asking each other if anyone had contacted Pierce. Did anyone have his contact information? Had Chen responded yet? What was the peer review timeline going to look like? Who had standing to submit on his behalf, given his lack of institutional affiliation? By noon, the informal network had expanded. People who hadn't been in the room had heard. A professor at Princeton received a forwarded email and called a colleague at MIT. A mathematician in London got a message from someone who'd been in the 5th row and called it in slightly breathless prose the most significant moment he'd witnessed in 30 years of academic conferences. By 2 p.m., someone had posted about it on a closed mathematics forum without Logan's name at first, just a description of what had happened, a janitor at a university symposium who had identified a structural collapse in the Carver-Holland framework's foundational assumption, and the responses came in fast and skeptical, and then, as people started running their own calculations, less skeptical and then not skeptical at all. Logan was running a lathe at the machine shop and had no idea any of this was happening. He found out at 4 p.m. when his phone sitting in his locker had accumulated 11 unread messages and 2 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize. He checked it on his break, standing in the parking lot outside the shop with a cup of coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. The missed calls were from a journalist. He didn't call back. The messages were from Marcus Webb, from Elaine Chen, And from two people he'd never heard of who had gotten his number from, he didn't know how they'd gotten his number. He read Chen's first. Proof is circulating informally, holding up under initial scrutiny. Expect formal attempts at replication within 48 hours. You need to get the formal version ready faster than 2 weeks. Can you do 10 days? He typed back, I can do 7. Her reply came in 40 seconds. Good. He drank the rest of the too-long coffee and went back to the lathe. At 5:30 p.m., while he was clocking out, a man he'd never seen before was standing outside the building. Mid-50s in a jacket that was expensive in the way that didn't advertise itself. He was looking at his phone, and when Logan walked out, he looked up and said, Logan Pierce? Logan stopped. Who are you? Logan. Daniel Holt. I work for Sophia Bennett. He paused, reading Logan's expression, which was flat and waiting. I know who Sophia Bennett is. Everyone knew who Sophia Bennett was. Founder of Bennett Applied Sciences, net worth somewhere north of $4 billion. Known for funding research programs that existing institutions considered too risky or too unconventional. She had a reputation for finding people before other people found them, which meant either excellent judgment or excellent intelligence gathering. And from everything Logan had ever read about her, it was both. She'd like to have a conversation, Holt said. At your convenience. She's in the city through Friday. Logan looked at him. Then he looked at the parking lot. Then he said, My convenience is currently limited. I'm dropping my daughter at school at 7:30 tomorrow morning. I have time before that. Holt did not blink. 6 a.m. 6:15. There's a diner on Caraway. The one with the blue awning. She'll be there, Holt said. He left. Logan watched him go, then got in the Silverado and thought for approximately 30 seconds about the accelerating velocity of the last 24 hours. Yesterday afternoon, he had raised his hand in the back of a room and been laughed at, and now he had a signed fellowship 7 days to complete a formal proof. His work circulating in closed academic forums in at least 3 countries, and a meeting with a $4 billion CEO at 6:15 in the morning at the diner on Caraway. He called Emma to tell her he was on his way. Dad, she said immediately, Mrs. Kowalski says there's something about you on the internet. He was quiet for 1 second. What does it say? She won't show me. She says it's adult stuff, but she's been reading it for an hour. A pause. She has a funny face. I'll explain when I get home, he said. Is it good or bad? No. He thought about Holloway, about Chen, about the red circle Rennick had drawn around the error with his own hand, about Daniel Holt in the parking lot, and 6:15 tomorrow morning, and 7 days. I genuinely don't know yet, he said, but I think we're going to find out pretty fast. He drove home through traffic that had the ordinary texture of a weekday evening, people heading home, radios on the city doing what cities do, and somewhere in the closed mathematics forum, a professor in Berlin had just finished running the full computation and posted 3 words in response to the thread about what had happened at Blackstone University's symposium the previous afternoon. The 3 words were, "The proof holds." Sophia Bennett was already at the diner when Logan arrived at 6:14 a.m. He noticed that first, not late, not exactly on time, early. Already seated, already with coffee, already reading something on her phone that she set face down on the table the moment he walked through the door. She was 51, he knew that from what he'd read about her. She looked it in the way that people who have been working hard their whole lives look their age, not worn down, but fully inhabited, like every year had been used. She was wearing a jacket that probably cost more than his car, and she was sitting in a vinyl booth in a diner on Caraway Street at 6 in the morning, like it was the most natural place in the world. She stood when he approached, extended her hand. Mr. Pierce? Ms. Bennett? They sat. A waitress appeared immediately, the kind of fast that happens when a woman who carries herself like Sophia Bennett comes into your diner at 6 a.m., and you understand instinctively that her time is not something to waste. Logan ordered coffee and eggs. Bennett said just coffee she'd eaten. She waited until the waitress was gone. Then she said, "I heard about yesterday." Word travels fast. In certain circles, yes. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I had 3 separate people contact me before 9 p.m. One of them was Elaine Chen." Logan looked at her. "You know Chen. I funded her lab's expansion in 2019. We've stayed in touch." Bennett paused. She described what happened in considerable detail. "She's not a person who uses hyperbole. She told me it was the most significant thing she'd witnessed in her career." Her eyes were direct, assessing, but not in the way Holloway's had been, less like a balance sheet, more like a person who was genuinely curious about another person and had enough experience to know that the interesting information was usually not the obvious one. "She said you found a journal in the trash. 3rd floor. Someone threw it out. And you read it." "I read everything I can find." Bennett was quiet for a moment. The diner had the particular early morning sound of a place doing real business. The kitchen, the coffee machine. 2 tables of people who worked with their hands and were fueling up before a shift. Logan was comfortable in this sound. He'd been sitting in diners at this hour his whole adult life. "Tell me something," Bennett said. "When you were in that room yesterday, when you walked to the front, what were you thinking?" Logan considered the question seriously the way it deserved. "I was thinking the math was right," he said, "and that someone needed to say it, and that I was the only person in the room who had nothing to lose by saying it." "That last part," she said. "You said it without bitterness." "It wasn't bitter, it was just true." "That's it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I built my company on people who thought differently. Not differently as a performance, actually differently structurally, because of how their lives had shaped them. The most valuable thing isn't the unusual answer, it's the unusual question. The ability to look at something everyone has accepted and ask why." She set her mug down. "You asked why. In a room full of people who'd been trained not to." "I wasn't trained at all," Logan said. "I ran out of training at 2.5 years. "I know, that's precisely what I mean." She looked at him steadily. "Margaret Holloway has offered you a fellowship." "She has. I'm not here to compete with that," Bennett said. "I want to offer you something different, not instead of in addition to, if you choose it. A research consultancy. Independent. Project-based. When we encounter problems that require the kind of thinking you demonstrated yesterday, you work on them. Your timeline, your methods, your conclusions. No institutional constraints, no committee approval, no politics." She paused. "Paid significantly better than cleaning floors." Logan said, "What kind of problems?" She smiled then, and it was a real smile, the kind that changes the whole face. "The ones no one else has solved, which is the only kind worth paying for." The eggs arrived. Logan ate. He did not pretend he wasn't hungry, and she did not pretend to look away while he ate, and somehow this made the conversation feel more honest than it might have otherwise. "I have a daughter," he said between bites. "2nd grade. She's my first priority. Before any proof, before any consultancy, before anything." "I understand that." "I don't think you do fully yet. I mean that she sets the terms. Not me. Not you. If something conflicts with being her father, it loses." Mom. Bennett looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I have 2 kids, grown now. I missed a lot when they were young." She said it without performance, without the strategic display of vulnerability that powerful people sometimes deploy to seem human. She just said it the way you say a fact that you've made your peace with, but that still costs you something when you say it out loud. "I don't want to be the reason someone else misses it." Logan looked at her. He believed her. That surprised him a little. "Then we can talk," he said. They talked for 45 minutes. By the end, Logan had a second card in his shirt pocket next to Chen's, and a follow-up meeting scheduled for the following week, and a clarity about his situation that had not existed 48 hours ago. The strange, disorienting clarity of a landscape that has changed so completely, that the map you'd been using is no longer accurate and you have to look at the actual terrain and learn it fresh.
Shy.
He dropped Emma at school at 7:40. She was carrying a drawing she'd made that morning. A man standing at a whiteboard, stick figures in rows in front of him. The man's hands very large because she'd run out of space and had to make them fit. She'd labeled it in her careful second-grade letters. My dad, the mathematician. The spelling was wrong and the picture was perfect. He watched her walk through the school doors and sat in the Silverado in the drop-off lane until the car behind him honked, then pulled forward and drove to the machine shop. The formal proof was coming together. Mice. He worked on it every night. Kitchen table, sticky tea key. The lamp casting its yellow circle over pages that were slowly, stubbornly, becoming what they needed to be. 7 days had seemed ambitious and turned out to be exactly right in the way that timelines you set yourself sometimes are when you know the territory because you've been living in it for months. By day 4, he had the core argument formalized, every assumption explicit. Every step justified the notation clean and standard. By day 6, he had the full first draft. By day 7, he had a version he would not be ashamed to put in front of Elaine Chen. He sent it to her at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Then he closed the laptop and went to bed. He slept 4 hours before his phone lit up. 3:14 a.m. A text from Chen. He stared at the screen in the dark, the phone's light bright against the ceiling. This is solid. Very solid. The argument is airtight through Section 4. I have 2 notational questions in Section 5. Minor won't affect the conclusion. I'm recommending we submit to Annals. Can you have revisions back to me in 48 hours? He typed back, yes. She responded, good. One more thing. Rennick asked if he could be acknowledged in the paper, as the framework that precipitated the discovery. I told him that was your decision. Logan stared at that for a long time. In the dark, in the small apartment with Emma sleeping in the next room and the cat from Mrs. Kowalski's apartment that had somehow ended up staying with them sitting on the foot of his bed, he thought about Arthur Rennick, about the red circle, about the voice that had said barely audibly, "How did no one catch this?" About a man who had built 11 years of work on a foundation that had just been removed from under him, and who had responded by sitting down and doing the math himself. He typed yes, acknowledge the framework. Chen replied, understood. Get me those revisions. He put the phone down. The cat relocated from the foot of the bed to directly on top of his legs, which was its decision, and Logan had learned not to argue with it. He lay there in the dark and thought about the 48 hours ahead and the journal submission and what happened after that. And then he stopped thinking about all of it deliberately and went back to sleep, because he had a 6 a.m. shift and his daughter needed her lunch packed and the revisions would be there in the morning, and that was enough for right now. The 48 hours passed. The revisions went back to Chen. 3 days later, she confirmed the submission to Annals of Mathematics, the most prestigious journal in the field, under the name Logan Pierce, Independent Researcher. Then the waiting began. Then peer review at Annals was not fast. This was by design. The process existed to be rigorous, not quick, and rigor in mathematics meant that every claim was checked, every step verified, every assumption tested by people whose professional function was to find the thing you missed. Logan understood this intellectually and found it excruciating anyway, in the way that understanding something and feeling it are 2 separate operations that don't always coordinate. He kept working. He took Holloway's fellowship. The formal start date was the 1st of the month, which was 8 days away, which meant he gave notice at the university janitorial service and worked his last night shift on a Thursday, mopping the same marble hallway of the Hargrove Mathematics building that he had mopped 100 times before. He did it with the same mechanical precision as always, long even strokes the sound of the building around him. He emptied the trash in conference room B, which was back to its normal configuration. Now no symposium banner, just the standard academic clutter of a room in active use. Someone had printed a copy of the forum post about what had happened at the symposium. It was pinned to the board inside the room near the window beside a department memo about parking permits. Logan stood and read it. It was several paragraphs written by someone who'd been in the audience describing the afternoon in the present tense, as if it were still happening. The last line was, "A man with no institution, no credentials, and a 99-cent notebook just changed what we know. I don't know what to do with that except write it down." Logan unpinned it, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket. He finished the wing, clocked out, turned in his ID badge to the night supervisor, a guy named Dave, who had worked the desk for 11 years, and who said when Logan handed it over, "Heard about the thing you did at the conference?" "Yeah. My kid's studying math at State. I told her about it." Dave looked at the badge, then at Logan. She said it was the coolest thing she'd ever heard. Logan didn't know what to say to that. He said, "Tell her to check her assumptions." Dave grinned. "I will." Logan walked out of the building for the last time as an employee and drove home. 3 weeks into the peer review, the first attack came. And he'd expected it. Holloway had predicted it with the calm certainty of someone who has watched institutions protect themselves many times. What he hadn't expected was the specific shape of it, which was a post on an academic blog written by a Professor Gerald Marsh of the University of Chicago, a man Logan had never heard of, but who had apparently built a significant portion of his recent work on derivative theorems that depended on the Rennick framework. The post was long and carefully worded, and on its surface engaged seriously with the mathematics, but it was structured in the way that hostile arguments are sometimes structured to redirect attention from the math to the source. It questioned whether an individual without institutional affiliation could have conducted the necessary background research. It suggested delicately but clearly that the proof may have had undisclosed assistance. It used the word independent in quotation marks twice. Logan read it once on a Wednesday morning over coffee. Then he sent it to 3 people, Holloway Chen and Marcus Webb. Chen's response came in 11 minutes. It was 14 words. "He's scared. His 2018 paper falls apart if yours holds. Don't respond." Webb's came in. 20. "I've already written a rebuttal. Can I post it or do you want to?" Logan typed back, "You post it. I'm going to keep working." Webb's rebuttal went up that afternoon. It was precise technical devastating in the way that precise technical responses to imprecise attacks always are. Because imprecision, when it encounters precision, does not win. Within 24 hours, 4 other mathematicians had posted responses of their own independently, without coordination. One of them was a Fields Medal winner Logan had read about in a magazine he'd found in a waiting room 3 years ago. The Fields medalist wrote 11 sentences. The last one was, "The work stands on its own merits." That it was done by a janitor with a composition notebook is extraordinary. That it is being questioned because of that fact is embarrassing. Marsh did not post again. 4 days later at 7:22 p.m. on a Thursday, Logan's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He answered. "Mr. Pierce?" A woman's voice. Formal, slightly breathless, like someone who has been moving fast and stopped just long enough to make this call. "This is Dr. Patricia Lund. I'm the associate editor at Annals of Mathematics." Logan sat down on the kitchen chair. "Yes, I'm calling to inform you that your paper has completed peer review." A pause. "It's been accepted for publication." The kitchen was very quiet. Emma was doing homework at the other end of the table, and she looked up at his face and went still, the pencil suspended above her worksheet, reading him the way she'd always been able to read him. "All 3 reviewers confirmed the proof," Lund continued. "One of them described it as..." Another pause, and he could hear the professionalism in her voice working to stay level, "as the most significant single correction to foundational mathematics in the last 2 decades. She paused once more. "Congratulations, Mr. Pierce. The paper will appear in next quarter's issue. We'll need your author bio." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do I put for institution?" "You can put independent researcher," she said. Some authors in your situation have also simply listed their city and state. What do most people in my situation do? A pause. Honestly, Mr. Pierce, we don't have many authors in your situation. This is somewhat unprecedented. He exhaled slowly. Independent researcher is fine. So they worked out the details. Publication date, the author bio, the formal correspondence address, the process for the page proofs. Logan wrote it all down on the same notepad he used for grocery lists. When the call ended, he set the phone on the table and sat there. Emma put down her pencil. Dad? Yeah. What happened? He looked at her. The drawing she'd made was still on the refrigerator. My dad, the mathematician. The hands too large, the stick figures in rows. He'd put it up there on the day she gave it to him and had not taken it down. You know the thing I've been working on, he said. The proof. The one that fixes the broken math. Yes. He stopped, tried to find the right language for a 7-year-old and realized it wasn't complicated. It's going to be published in the most important math journal in the world, under my name. Emma looked at him very seriously. Then she got up from her chair, walked around the table, and hugged him with the full commitment that 7-year-olds bring to Hug's arms, tight face pressed against his shoulder. No reservation. He held on. After a moment, she said into his shoulder, Does this mean you're not a janitor anymore? I haven't been a janitor for a few weeks. I know, but does it mean... She pulled back, looked at him. Does it mean people know now that you're good at math? He thought about 300 people in a room going quiet. About a red circle drawn around an error. About 11 words in an email at 3 a.m. that said, This is solid, very solid. About a Fields medalist posting 11 sentences, the last of which contained the word extraordinary. Yeah, Bug, he said. I think people know. She nodded, went back to her chair, picked up her pencil, looked at her homework worksheet, and then looked back up at him. Can you help me with number 7, its fractions? He pulled his chair around to her side of the table. Show me, he said. He looked at number 7, looked at his daughter's careful 2nd-grade handwriting around it. The attempted work she'd already done, the place where she'd erased and started over. He saw exactly where she'd gone wrong and exactly how to show her where the path was without walking it for her, because that was the only way to teach anything. And somewhere across the city, in a closed academic forum that had grown to 700 members in the 3 weeks since the symposium, someone posted a link to the Annals acceptance announcement with no commentary at all, just the link, and in the next 40 minutes it was shared 46 times, and the comments came in fast and serious, and in 4 languages. And one of them from a professor in Sao Paulo, who had been working in the Carver-Holland space for 8 years, said simply, The foundation has changed. Everything we build from here builds on different ground. Logan was explaining fractions to his daughter and didn't see any of this until the next morning. But it was happening. All of it was happening, building in the way that real things build, not with fanfare, not in a straight line, but with the unstoppable accumulating force of something true, that has been correctly stated and cannot be taken back. The Annals issue dropped on a Tuesday. The Annals issue. Logan found out at 6:47 a.m., the same way he found out about most things now, his phone, which had become a different kind of object in the last 3 weeks. It used to be a thing for Emma's school texts and shift reminders, and the occasional call from Mrs. Kowalski. Now it was something else. Something that required management. Chen texted first 6 words. It's live. Annals website. Check now. He was standing in the kitchen in his socks, coffee in one hand, Emma's lunchbox open on the counter, and he set the coffee down and pulled up the Annals of Mathematics website on his cracked screen Android. And there it was. His name. His title. His proof. Formatted in the clean, austere typography of the most important mathematics journal in the world, the same journal that had published Wiles's proof of Fermat's last theorem, the same journal that represented the highest standard the field had. on the structural collapse of the epsilon-bound assumption in the Carver-Holland framework. Logan Pierce, independent researcher. He stood in the kitchen and read his own name in that context and felt something move through him that he had no category for. Not triumph, not relief. Something older and quieter than either of those. The feeling of a thing that has been true for a long time finally being visible. Emma came out in her school clothes shoes already on, which was unusual and meant she'd been awake earlier than he'd thought. She looked at his face. "Is it out?" "Yeah," he said. She held out her hand. He showed her the screen. She looked at it with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered, then handed the phone back. "Your name's first," she said. "I'm the only author." "Good," she said. Then she picked up her lunchbox and her backpack completely satisfied and said, "Can we have pancakes this weekend?" He stared at her. "Pancakes? You said when the big thing was done we'd have celebration pancakes." She looked at him patiently. "The big thing is done." He laughed. A real one. Sudden, the kind that comes from somewhere below conscious thought. "Yeah, Bug, pancakes this weekend." She nodded, accepting this as contractually binding, and went to wait by the door. He dropped her at school, drove home, sat at the kitchen table, and watched the world respond. The first hour was the academic world. The annals posting circulated through the closed forums, the university email chains, the group chats of mathematics departments on 3 continents. By 8 a.m., the paper had been downloaded 900 times. By 9:30, it was over 4,000. Chen sent a running commentary via text, which Logan read while simultaneously working through the formal acknowledgments he owed the journal. The correspondence was dense and procedural and required his full attention, which was good because it kept him from refreshing the download counter every 4 minutes. At 10:15, the press found it. He didn't know exactly how. Probably the forum posts, probably someone with a media contact, probably the Fields medalist's earlier public comment, which had already been quoted in 2 science newsletters. However, it happened by mid-morning. His name was appearing in places it had never appeared before. A wire service ran a short piece. A major science publication posted a summary. A general news outlet picked it up from there, and in their hands, the story became a different thing. Not the mathematics, which they couldn't fully convey and didn't really try, but the human shape of it. The janitor, the notebook, the symposium, the laughter. His phone started ringing from numbers he didn't recognize, and he stopped answering it. At noon, Holloway called from a number he did recognize. He answered. "How are you managing?" she said. "I'm not answering my phone." "Wise. I've had 4 media inquiries this morning asking for a statement from the university. I told them the fellowship is independent and that your work speaks for itself." "Thank you. I want to be clear," she said, "that I am not managing your press. That's not what the fellowship is for. But I want to know if you need resources, institutional support for correspondence, anything like that." "I need someone to answer my phone," he said. A pause. "I can arrange a communications contact, temporarily." "That would help." She made a sound that was almost approval. "I'll have someone reach out this afternoon." Another pause, briefer. "Pierce, the paper is exceptional. I want you to know that I've read it in full, not just the summary." Her voice was as controlled as always, but there was something under it. Something that had been there since the afternoon she'd laughed, and then watched the room go quiet, and then sat beside Chen, reading a 99-cent notebook. "What you did was real. I don't say that about much." Logan said, "I appreciate that." After the call, he sat with the quiet for exactly 90 seconds. Then his laptop showed an email from an address he didn't recognize with a subject line that made him stop. He opened it. It was from Harold Carver. Not the dead one. There were 2 Harold Carvers. It turned out, father and son, and the father's work had launched the conjecture 40 years ago, and the son was 73 years old, retired, living in Vermont, and had apparently been following the situation since the forum posts. The email was 4 sentences. "Mr. Pierce, My father spent the last decade of his life troubled by a feeling that something in the framework wasn't right. He could never locate it. I believe you have found what he was looking for. Thank you. Logan read it 3 times. Then he wrote back carefully and said that he was honored to have worked in the space Harold Carver Sr. had opened and that he hoped the correction served the work as it deserved. He sent it. Then he sat there for a moment in the kitchen in his apartment, the same apartment he'd been in for 4 years. The refrigerator with Emma's drawing still taped to it. The sticky tea laptop open in front of him. And he thought about Harold Carver Sr., a mathematician who'd spent the last decade of his life with a feeling that something was wrong, unable to locate it, carrying that uncomfortable knowledge the way Logan had carried mathematics itself for years, not as a credential or a career, but as a thing that simply lived in him and would not be quiet. He understood that completely. Then the knock at the door came. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened it and found Arthur Rennick standing in the hallway of his building, not accompanied by anyone. Not in the academic jacket he'd worn at the symposium in a regular coat, the kind you wear in November when the temperature drops without warning. He was holding a flat cardboard box, the kind used for document transport, and he looked like a man who had driven to this address and then sat outside in his car for 20 minutes, deciding whether to actually come up. Logan stood in the doorway and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment called for. Rennick said, "I should have called." "You don't have my number." "I got it from Webb." He paused. "With your permission," he said to tell you he asked. Logan stepped back from the doorway. Rennick came in. He stood in Logan's kitchen, 6'2", silver-haired, the man who had smiled at his own triumph and swept his hand toward the whiteboard with theatrical grace and looked around the space. The way people look around a space when they're trying not to make it obvious they're looking around the space. The refrigerator drawing, the notepad with grocery lists and the name of the Annals editor, the stack of composition notebooks on the counter, the older ones worn, and warped, the newer ones clean. Rennick set the cardboard box on the kitchen table. "What is that?" Logan said. "My derivation work. The full development of the framework from the original 1983 notes forward." He kept his hand flat on the top of the box for a moment. 11 years of working notebooks. Every step, every false start, every version that didn't survive. He looked at Logan. "I thought you should have them." Logan looked at the box, then at Rennick. "Why?" "Because you're the one doing the reconstruction," Rennick said. "Because the work that comes after this, the work of rebuilding what needs to be rebuilt on the corrected foundation, will go faster if you understand how the original framework developed, where it went wrong and why." He paused. "And because you earned them." The kitchen was very quiet. Logan said, "You didn't have to do this." "No," Rennick agreed. "I didn't." He stood straight, which on a 6'2" man is a statement. "The paper is excellent. The peer reviewers were correct." He said it the way a man says something that cost him something to say and is paying it anyway because it's accurate. "I've spent the last 3 weeks rereading my own work through the lens of what you showed us. There are 4 additional places where the degradation has downstream effects I hadn't fully traced. I think you've already found 2 of them." 3, Logan said. Something moved in Rennick's face. Recognition, and under it something warmer than Logan had expected. "Then you're ahead of me," he said, "which is where you should be." Logan pulled out a chair. "Do you want coffee?" Rennick sat down. "Please." They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Not about the symposium, not about the laughter, not about the history between them that was only weeks old and already felt older. They talked about mathematics, specific technical, the kind of conversation Logan had never had with another person in his adult life, because there had never been another person available to have it with. They talked about the 3 downstream effects he'd found, and the one Rennick suspected existed in the 2007 extension. They talked about the reconstruction, what it would require, the timeline, the approach. At one point, Rennick said, "The approach you used to identify the degradation. The structural diagram before the formulas. Where did that come from?" I had to be able to explain it to myself first, Logan said. Before I formalized it. I always start with what the thing is trying to do before I think about how it does it. Rennick was quiet for a moment. I've been teaching the opposite for 30 years, he said. Start with the formal structure. The formal structure can hide the flaw, Logan said. If you start with what it's supposed to do, the flaw becomes visible earlier. Rennick looked at him for a long time. Then he opened his own notebook, the leather-bound one fat with decades, and wrote something down. He didn't say what it was. He didn't need to. When he left, Logan walked him to the door. At the threshold, Rennick turned and said, "There's going to be a second symposium, a reconstruction symposium, to formally address what the correction means for the field." He paused. "I'd like you to present." Logan said, "Not at the back of the room." "No," Rennick said. "At the front." Logan nodded. Rennick left. Logan closed the door and stood in his kitchen, with the cardboard box of 11 years of someone else's work on his table and the refrigerator drawing on his wall, and the sticky tea laptop open to the annals page with his name on it. And he thought about the distance from the parking lot at 1 a.m. to this kitchen at noon on a Tuesday, and the distance was not as large as it should have been, which meant either that this moment was smaller than it felt, or that the parking lot had been larger than it looked. He decided it was the second one. The media situation did not resolve itself quickly. The communications contact Holloway sent over a calm, efficient woman named Priya Mehta. Not the same Priya as Rennick's graduate student. Different person helped filter the requests into categories: legitimate, science journalism, general press, television, and what Priya called the noise, which covered everything from conspiracy blogs to a podcast host who wanted to frame Logan's story as evidence that universities were suppressing genius, which was not what had happened, and was not a story Logan was interested in telling. He did 2 interviews. One with a science publication whose mathematics coverage he respected. He'd read 3 of their long-form pieces in journals he'd found or borrowed over the years. One with a general newspaper whose education reporter asked good questions and listened to the answers rather than waiting to insert the next question. Both interviewers asked about the laughter. Shashus. He said the same thing to both of them because it was true and because it was the only thing worth saying. The laughter was the right response to the situation as people understood it. A janitor standing up in a symposium to challenge a professor, that's absurd on its face. The math didn't become more correct because people stopped laughing. It was always correct. The laughter just made the room quieter when they stopped. The science publication ran that quote. The newspaper ran it too. It got picked up from there, passed around in the way that quotes get passed around when they say something that feels like it was waiting to be said. Sophia Bennett called him the Friday after the publication. "I've been watching how you've handled the press," she said. "Mostly I've been avoiding it." "That's handling it," she said. "Correctly." A pause. "I have a problem I want to bring you. It's not mathematics, it's computational. But the underlying structure is similar to what you described in your approach to the epsilon question, looking at what the system is supposed to do before looking at how it does it." "Tell me the problem," Logan said. She told him. It took 8 minutes. He asked 2 questions. She answered them. He was quiet for 40 seconds, and she was smart enough not to fill the silence. "I need to think about it," he said. "Can you give me a week?" "Take 2, she said. "This one's been waiting long enough that another 2 weeks won't matter." He spent the first 3 days of that 2 weeks not thinking about the problem consciously, which was how he'd always worked. Let it run in the background, the way a process runs in the background of a system, consuming resources quietly, while the foreground does other things. He made Emma's lunches and went to the grocery store and worked through the correspondence with Annals about the page proofs and had dinner with Marcus Webb, who had become a genuine friend over the last month with the speed that genuine friendship sometimes develops when 2 people have been through something real together. They ate at a Thai place near the university. Marcus ordered too much food, which Logan had already identified as a consistent character trait, and talked with his hands, which was another one. Prentice Okafor is officially being retracted, Marcus said. They announced it yesterday. I heard. That's 3 major retractions tied directly to your paper, in 6 weeks. Marcus shook his head, not in dismay, but in the stunned wonder of someone who is watching history happen in real time and hasn't quite caught up. Do you understand how significant that is? I understand the math of it, Logan said. The human part is still strange. Does it feel like you thought it would? Logan considered this seriously. I never thought it would, he said. Thinking it would have required thinking it was possible, and for a long time it wasn't possible. It was just something I did because I couldn't not do it. He picked up his fork. It feels like the math feels when it resolves, not like winning, like the right answer appearing, quiet, inevitable, like it was always going to be there. Marcus looked at him across the table and said, You should be teaching. I'm not credentialed. After what's happened in the last 6 weeks, your credential is your name. Logan said nothing. He thought about it later, driving home the way he thought about things that mattered without forcing them, letting them find their shape. He thought about the classroom at Michigan, the professor who had stopped mid-sentence because a student in the 3rd row had asked a better question. He thought about Emma working through fractions at the kitchen table, and the way he'd shown her where she'd gone wrong without walking the path for her. He thought about the postdoc in the bathroom who'd known the truth and been told his career couldn't survive saying it. He pulled into the parking lot of his building, the same cracked mirror Silverado. The same lot. Though now he was starting to think seriously about the transmission, which had developed a complaint, and sat there for a moment. The sky was the deep clear blue of a November evening that's decided to be beautiful about it. He thought, what is the right thing to build from here? Not for the field, not for Holloway or Bennett or Annals or the 700-member forum or the reporters who wanted the quote about the laughter. For Emma, who was in 2nd grade, and who had held out her hand to look at his name on a screen and said, Your name's first, and then asked about pancakes. For the Harold Carver, who was 73 years old and living in Vermont, and whose father had spent a decade with an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't locate. For the version of Logan Pierce, who had been sitting in a service corridor at midnight with a 99-cent notebook and a pen he uncapped with his teeth, and a problem that would not leave him alone. The right thing was to keep working. That was the answer, and it had always been the answer, and no amount of publication or symposium or fellowship or $4 billion CEO meetings changed it. The work was the work. The math was either right or it wasn't. You followed the river to see where it went, and when you got there, you looked for the next river. He went upstairs. He went. Emma was at the kitchen table with her homework, and Mrs. Kowalski's cat was on the chair beside her in the way it had taken to doing supervising the arithmetic with the authority of a creature that has decided this is its responsibility. Emma looked up when he came in, looked at his face, processed what she saw there. Good day, she said. Good day, he said. Are you going to work on math tonight? He hung up his jacket. For a little while. After you're in bed. She nodded, accepting this as the natural order of things, which it was. She turned back to her homework. He made dinner the reliable pasta, the one he could make without looking, because he'd made it 500 times, and they ate together at the kitchen table. And Emma told him about a fight between 2 kids at school that had been resolved through what sounded like genuinely sophisticated negotiation for 2nd grade, and he listened with his full attention, because this was the most important conversation he was going to have today, and he knew it. Net. After dinner, Dish's homework checked the specific small negotiations of bedtime. He sat on the edge of her bed while she got settled the same as every night. She said, Dad, do you think you'll be famous? He thought about this honestly. For a little while, maybe, in a small field. Is that good? It's fine, he said. The proof doesn't care if anyone knows my name. She looked at the ceiling. I know your name. Yeah, he said. That's the one that counts. She seemed satisfied, her eyes closed. He waited until her breathing changed, and then sat there one more moment in the dark of her room, listening to the quiet of the apartment around him, the refrigerator hum, the distant street sounds, the familiar weight of a life that had been built from what was available, which had turned out to be enough. He went to the kitchen table, opened the laptop, uncapped the pen with his teeth. At the top of a clean page, he wrote 3 words, "What do we assume?" Then he began. The world would spend the next decade relearning what it thought it knew, rebuilding on corrected ground, following the river that Logan Pierce had found in a parking lot at 1 a.m., with a flickering light above him and 4 pages of composition book handwriting that said what it said regardless of who was listening. The papers would come. The symposium would come. The reconstruction would take years and produce better mathematics than the original, and would carry in its foundation permanently the correction that a single father with rough hands and a 99-cent notebook had written out quietly while everyone else was asleep. He had not waited for permission. He had not waited for credentials or a title or a room that would take him seriously. He had followed the math because the math was true, and truth does not require an invitation. He was a janitor who had cleaned the floors of a building where the world's best mathematical minds had gathered, and he had seen what they missed, and he had said so, and he had been right, and the foundation of 40 years of human knowledge had shifted because of it. And on Saturday morning he made pancakes,